Great. Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you, everybody, for dialing in to our WebEx today on entitled "Navigating Your Journey to Resilience." So I'll talk in a minute a little bit more about what we really mean by that, and I'll introduce our speakers. But first, some logistics. Okay, sorry, I've got something on the screen. Okay, so on the logistics. So as we go through, I know we're all familiar with using the WebEx these days, but please do any questions you have as you go through. Please type them in. The session today, at least the presentation part of it, should be 45 minutes. So we'll leave 15 minutes at the end for some Q&A. If we don't get to all those questions, we'll sort of follow up with you, and also the deck will be available to anybody that would like it after the call. But please, do feel free, type in any questions as we go. And we're also got like 3 or 4 poll questions as well. So it'd be great if you could just quickly participate in that. It'll help us see the areas that you're particularly focused on, and help help us sort of focus our discussion around that. Okay, so that's the logistics. Okay, so the speakers today, that on the right hand side, that's me. You can see I'm the risk management leader for Marsh & Agent. That basically means our large clients, which I think is largely you guys. Reed Sawyer, Reed, as you can see, is a managing director, head of emerging risk group based in the US. And Derek Taylor, Derek is here in Singapore. He's our head of strategic risk consulting with Marsh Advisory. So Reed and Derek will be doing the presentation today. Okay. Okay, so just to sort of set the scene on this, I think many of you on the call today, you work in the risk and insurance areas in some way. In risk, at least in insurance and world in particular, our traditional sort of view and the things we think about all day is, is our manufacturing plant going to catch fire? Is there going to be an earthquake? Are we going to lose production? Are we going to have loss of revenue? Could people, either employees or third parties, be killed or injured in that process? Do we have liabilities around those type of things? And all those things absolutely exist. They're there, they're very serious, and we kind of need to sort of work with them on a day-to-day basis. But, as we all know and we see as we kind of follow the news, the world is an increasingly interconnected but complex place. And there are many other sort of areas of risk and insurance complementary to that, beyond what we kind of think about in our traditional areas. So we've grouped some of those risks. There's like 6 areas we've grouped, which we'll talk about today, under the heading of like, how do we make our businesses more resilient to some of these sort of broader risk areas? So, as we go through today, we're going to talk a little about cyber. Cyber's in the news every day. This is real. It's not about the future. It's about now. Climate, as part of the ESG suite. Again, climate, it's in the news all the time. We've seen in the last week, the heat waves in Canada, extraordinary temperatures, amazing floods at the weekend in Germany. And I think, right now, I think many of us in Asia are aware that there's very serious flooding taking place in Henan. To the extent that there's actually a dam there, which is apparently at risk. So, these are all things related to, changes in our sort of global climate. ESG, a very huge and a broad topic that we're all sort of involved in, but obviously looking at areas of racial injustice and gender equality, and of course the governance aspect of that. So we need to make sure we have a governance framework around these things. This is kind of what's expected today. Geopolitical. Again, I don't need to tell you, it's in the media every day, countries jostling with each other in some way or another. Regulatory as well. We have different regulators in different countries, and this, as you can see, gets tied into the geopolitical area. We have sort of China and the US constantly sort of jostling around, geopolitical, regulatory type of issues that can potentially impact all of our businesses in some way. Pandemic, it's everyday discussion, has been for the last 18 months now. But, scientists tell us that COVID is not the end of it. There is more to come. And then finally, emerging technology, AI, robotics, these are all things, they're about now, they're not about the future, but it changes the risk environments for our businesses. So, this is, maybe seems a little bit technical, but it is all about now, and it is all very real. So with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Reed, to take us through.
Paul, thank you very much for that introduction. And I think the context that you established for the conversation today is really spot on, right? I mean, this is not something about the future risk. I very much appreciate how you framed it, that this is about the now. And I think the ultimate question that we're trying to answer as we think about how these shock events will impact our value chains is really sort of threefold, right? The first is how do we gain better insight and anticipation to understanding how these events might unfold in front of us, right? Which really requires us, as you see the first point on the agenda here, is how do we define this challenge before us, right? But it's not just simply enough to define that challenge and to anticipate events. We need to be understanding this idea of resiliency in a different dimension, right? We need to be thinking about and defining, I would at least argue to you in our research here at Marsh, that we've done globally with many of you that have participated in the survey and in the report, have showed that there is something different, qualitative about this challenges that we're facing now, qualitatively different, that require this difference in understanding resiliency. And then finally, I think the third point is from the agenda is, can we measure resiliency, right? Which is a little bit of a silly way for me to frame the question, because of course Derek and I all are going to tell you that we believe that it can be measured. But I think that that's a call to action that we have in how we think about risk management, how we think about the transfer of risk, right? The structure of risk transfer programs, and really then defining and thinking about what were the findings from this global report that we discovered, but not the global results as much, but really zeroing in on Asia and what you all, right, what your contemporaries and yourselves told us about how we should be thinking about the risk before finally turning to this idea of what's next and how can we be defining these threats. So with that, let's talk a little bit about defining the challenge before us for a moment. And I think, Paul, we could start the first poll question if we go down 2 slides. Great. So poll question number 1, right? How does your organization challenge its traditional enterprise risk management views to anticipate severe disruptions or shock events? Please mark yes or no, and we'll see what the results hold. It always feels like the clock is ticking slow as we're waiting for the results to come in, but appreciate your participation. Great, so the results are in, right? So 68%, better than 2/3 are challenging your traditional enterprise risk management views to be thinking about these shock events. With 32%, right, just under 1/3 indicating that that's not necessarily the case. I think this is a fascinating split and something that we can discuss as we move through there, because it really is this idea about how do we anticipate these types of shocks and what can we do differently as we're thinking forward, even for those organizations of views that are challenging our traditional views to this. So let's go to the next slide and kind of dive into the challenges that we've set forth, or at least that we're seeing from this. Look, I think that, and as all of you would recognize, because all of you are leaders in risk, right? You're leading your organizations the way you think, define, act, transfer, and design the transfer of the risk, the way you're hedging your balance sheet risk from this perspective. But yet, it's a little bit pedestrian for me to tell you at this point that more than ever, the velocity of risk, the speed at which that risk is impacting your organizations, our clients, is accelerating, and indeed that I would argue that in many dimensions, as Derek and I have been discussing for some time now, right, that the severity of those shocks are increasing. But it's not just that it's the speed, the frequency, and severity, but we're seeing these shocks impact our clients' value chains, indeed your value chains, in more ways, in more dimensions than we've seen necessarily in the past, and that's largely due to a few factors, right? I think the first, as we try to gain intellectual purchase on these issues, is challenging ourselves with this question about how do we price these emerging risks. And by price, I don't necessarily mean the premium that we're paying for the risk transfer programs and how we're insuring that risk, but really how is it that we can understand the P&L or the balance sheet impact of an event, Paul, like you were mentioning, but like emerging technologies as we're increasing the deployment of robotics or artificial intelligence in our operations, right? How do we understand what risks that poses to our organization? But too oftentimes, right, I think that there's a tendency to want to define those risks and price that risk in the way that we can transfer it to the insurance markets, rather than thinking necessarily about what the totality of that risk means to the organization. That suggests, secondly, I think in the second part of this challenge before us, is perhaps, is there a better way that we can anticipate the risks? And indeed, critical to this idea of anticipating the risk is how do we connect those risks to our strategies, right? It's not just enough to be thinking about this, to have a challenging of our very traditional enterprise risk management frameworks, but I would well expect that 68% of you that indicated that you are challenging your traditional frameworks, that hopefully you're then aligning how you're measuring not only your current state risk, but the risk of your out year strategies, right? Are you entering new markets? Are you thinking about acquisitive activity in 2 to 3 year time horizons? How is it that we could be thinking about the future of physical climate risk to our organizations and our supply chains as our strategies evolve from our organizations? And then finally, this leads us into the third question, or the third challenge for this evening is, you know, quite honestly, what are the metrics that matter when we're evaluating resiliency? Derek and I have included this idea, though, that the flip side of resiliency, right, it's not just about measuring strength or the resilient nature of an organization, but really the flip side of that concept is how do we measure and understand, and indeed in some organizations, right, presenting metrics of fragility. How do I know how much of a shock event can I absorb within my organization before my supply chain breaks, or before my physical assets, my manufacturing plants are at risk, or understanding the degree of contingent business interruption that my organization is facing from all of those other suppliers or vendors and partners, right, that you're dependent on for your operations. But what these three challenges are really highlighting for us in this idea that if we're correct, right, that we are challenged more than ever to be thinking about this future, but not just the future, but connecting the present and future of our risk profiles, in this idea of resiliency, that perhaps when we think about the concept of resiliency, we need to be able to have a clear definition of what we're talking about. And I would suggest to you that the traditional definition of resiliency that we've tended to rely on in our industry, and indeed in other industries, whether it's high-performing organizations, or those industries like critical infrastructure, right, where we've been studying reliability of those organizations for better than 2 decades, tend to think about resiliency in the first and most common definition, which is a sense of how much of a shock can my organization absorb, right, that absorptive capacity of an event before my organization suffers a blow to the organization, or if indeed that we do suffer from that shock event, how quickly can we rebound from that? This concept of resiliency, is a very traditional notion of that, is something that's both useful in the way that we think about resiliency, and necessary in the way that we're defining it. But I would argue to a point that it's not sufficient for the way that we need to be posturing our organizations around risk in the future, which is really to say that there's a second dimension of resiliency that we've defined in the report that hopefully that many of you have read or will read, and we'll continue to talk about the report this evening. But the second dynamic is, how do we design our organizations to be resilient such that we can seek competitive advantage? In other words, it's when the seas are calm, right, that when we're not facing the turbulence or those shocks to our value chains, that it's the preparation and indeed the anticipation of these types of shock events that posture us for success and competitive advantage we go forward. And when we contemplate resiliency with these two dimensions, the absorptive capacity, the snap back, right, how fast I can respond and recover my organizations, with this idea of planning for the future and gaining competitive advantage, I suggest that really starts to challenge the way that we tend to think about measuring risks at the enterprise level, the way that we need to be defining these, and indeed really getting at the third challenge you see on this slide here, which is really defining the better metrics to help us think about these duality, the dual concept of fragility and resiliency. So let's go to the next slide if we can. So this idea that this risk environment being more dynamic than ever before, and this argument that I'm presenting to you tonight that Derek is going to expound on, and we're going to spend the balance of our time talking about, right? It's this really, it's one that's a call to action, that there's something different in the way that we're experiencing risk today. Not only is it because of the nature of risk I was talking about before, but certainly it's also being driven by the fact that our value chains are more connected than they ever have been before, right? It's the efficiency that we've driven throughout our value chain, throughout our operations, over the past 15, 20 years of the Lean Six Sigma approach to manufacturing, the way we think about agility in our systems, the just-in-time delivery networks. But regardless of how we define it or what aspect of our organizations we're talking about, we have never been more connected with one another, and indeed more dependent on one another than we have been before. And I would argue that means that our current risk tools, to a degree, are not rising to the challenge, that they're not providing us with that entirety of the vision, that the holistic approach, the way that we can gain intellectual purchase on the types of risks that are challenging us. And indeed, I think that the two quotes on the right part of this slide from multinational clients, right, that are operating with heavy degree of operations inside of Asia and indeed globally, really captured this. These quotes coming from chief risk officers that we've been dealing with the Fortune 500, which we're suggesting two dynamics to this, right? The one is that as we think about planning for risk, right, whether it's from an enterprise risk management perspective or a business continuity perspective, that there's something more and there's something different that we need to do. And in fact, that the comment that we heard yesterday from a chief risk officer that has extensive operations across Asia, her comment was that I need to move my ERM program from a process-centered approach to managing risk in my organization. That's something that's more dynamic, that allows our decision makers to be able to anticipate better and drive these risks. So let's take to the next slide and let's kind of move into the next poll question from here, because I'm really curious, we're curious, as to which of the emerging risks, the 6 that we looked about in that we studied in the report, are of most concern to the audience. So whether that's climate and ESG, and let's group those two together for the purpose of our discussion today, cyber, emerging technologies, again, distinct, geopolitical, pandemic, and regulatory. We'll take just a moment. It almost feels, Paul, like we should have handicapped the answer on this and put up our own bets to where the poll was going to come up to see today. So perhaps not surprising, right, that this idea, Paul, you talked about, that scientists are assuring us that SARS-CoV-2 is not the end of the pandemics, and indeed, you know, starting from the bottom, that maybe we're living in an era of pandemics. And perhaps not surprising that cyber risk is seen so highly. Very interesting and consistent with the reports out of Asia and the data that we'll talk about a little bit before, but Asia is really leading in our survey, in our global survey of our clients. The climate and ESG is the one of the top rated issues and concerns in this geography, and I think for good cause. And it's something, right, that is the rest of the world is quickly catching up to. I think the one thing that surprises me about the poll results today with this is that emerging technologies are so low when we think about the linkages between those and the other technology risks represented in cyber. Perhaps we can explore that, Derek, as we dive into this a little bit more. But Derek, any thoughts as you're looking at these results or comments I can impose on you, sir?
Yeah, thanks, Reed. So I'm encouraged by the fact that the group has identified climate and ESG as a top concern. That is kind of departs from kind of the larger, like, global set of data, and that's important, right? So I think this is good. This has been identified, and I think that it's very relevant in Asia as the climate risks. Climate change-driven risks here are real material. In fact, a recent poll came out, excuse me, not a poll, but actually an analysis where the out of the top 100 cities in the world that are most exposed to climate change-driven physical risks, 99 of them are located within Asia. So I think this is a good result.
Thanks, Eric. I think the other dimension of ESG and climate that I would ask the audience to think about, and as we're moving forward with that, with the discussion this evening, is an analysis conducted by the World Economic Forum, which suggests that the three dimensions of people, planet, and processes, right? This idea of the environment, the social dynamics, and the governance aspects are certainly significant, but that there's a missing component to those three dimensions in the way we think about posturing our organizations for future risk, which is to say that the World Economic Forum argued, or at least advocated, that resiliency is the missing dimension of that rubric. And so certainly I think, Derek, as we see that in that the statistic, that the study that you're citing there, and you think about the imperative of climate change and understanding that risk to the organizations is really significant as we move through there. So let's go to the next slide and kind of start to dive into the discussion a little bit further today. Right, so there's this idea that as we start to think about resiliency, with this two-part definition that we were discussing a few minutes ago, in light of these 6 risks, the question really becomes for us is how do we understand the impacts to our organization? Again, back to that third challenge of then if it's understanding the impact to your organization, how can I develop better metrics as a risk leader in my organization, dynamic metrics that's helping me think, again, not only about the risks that I'm going to be facing today, but the risk that I'm going to be facing in the future. And that's really, I think, at the heart of the advocacy of the discussion and what we're going to be talking about for the balance of our time. So let's take this idea and let's move to poll question number 3 if we can. Paul, I'm not sure if we warned them that there was going to be a test this evening. No grades. But poll question number 3, on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you think your risks are aligned to your operational and your strategic objectives? So in other words, how is your risk profile and the way that you're mapping that risk profile aligning to the strategy of your organization and its operational objectives as you're moving forward? Yeah, very interesting, right? So when you think about these numbers, and I think this is fantastic, right? So very few on both ends of the spectrum of not aligned versus fully aligned, right? So almost real parity at that. And then similarly, as we think about little alignment, right, suggesting most of obviously 60% sitting in that moderate alignment. And I think this is really one of the challenges that when we think about risk programs, is in such dynamic and fast-paced organizations that oftentimes risk is the last consideration that's brought into the discussion, and yet becomes one of the most important, right, from a balance sheet protection and a strategy perspective. So not surprisingly, that nearly 60% of you, presented that there's moderate alignment with only 25% having high alignment, right? So meaning that other 76% of this, really 75%, is a real challenge in the space to move forward. Let's go to the next slide as we think through this and talk just a little bit about what we saw globally to contextualize that result, which is this headline that really in some ways shocked us as Paul and I and Derek were reviewing the results, that too many of our clients are struggling to align risk and insurance strategies to their overall growth strategies. And again, I think this really comes down to sort of 3 dimensions, right? The first is the speed at which businesses are moving, as we were articulating a moment ago. The second is this kind of idea that oftentimes there's a challenge that what else we've seen in the risk survey, and Derek, I think you're going to talk about it a little bit later, but is this idea of how integrated are the risk functions across the enterprise, right? And that degree of integration or lack thereof inhibits the ability for organizations to align these 2 programs. then really I think the third dimension is something that's perhaps a bit pedestrian and maybe a bit obvious, but it's incredibly difficult to take on some of these challenges about thinking about what my out year risk looks like and how we can calculate it and drive that from that perspective. But Derek, any comments from you or Paul on this idea? Because as we look about the statistic, it really says, to me at least, that there's some real opportunity for our clients and the ways that we need to be supporting them, not dissimilar from the poll results that we saw from those on this call.
Yeah, sure, Reed, thanks. And I think what clients are most interested in doing is measuring what matters and then managing what matters. And so I think that's why we want to take this opportunity midway through 2021, and depending on which country you are, a year and a half into the COVID pandemic, to reassess your organization's approach to risk management. It's almost a good pause in some ways to make sure you're focusing on getting the most results out of the key areas, functions of risk management within your organization. And so I think that's good, because once you start to measure what matters and manage what matters, then you're really going to get the most leverage out of the resources which you put into your risk management functions.
Yeah. Also, Reed, we traditionally really very much think about risk management, of course, as protecting the business, but also we can think about it in the way, as the environment changes, how do we align with strategy to actually create competitive advantage from risk management?
Yeah, and that is something where I think, right, the advancement that we're all striving for as we look forward. I think that really we can kind of bring that forward as we look at the next slide. Thank you both for those comments. As we think about this idea about adopting this long-term perspective to risk, right? More than just where are my market pressures with my annual renewals, as I'm thinking about my cyber renewal or my executive liabilities, I'm thinking going forward from that perspective, or my property, whatever that program might be, right? Is this idea of, can we think about a longer-term perspective to risk? How do we adopt that risk, that perspective, seek that competitive advantage, Paul, that you're talking about, where risk management really becomes a function and enabler from that perspective. And it's fundamentally around this idea of developing a resilient culture. I think when we look at these stats, right, in this view to this idea about how do we integrate risk and strategy, if we start in that upper right-hand quadrant, right, again, with an idea that 80% number that we saw on the last slide for all clients that resulted from the survey, that even those that we would think about as being some of the most sophisticated organizations, whether rightly or wrongly, right, we tend to associate that with size and revenues of the company, that better than 2/3 of those organizations above 10 billion in revenues are struggling with it. But at the same time, I think there's a challenge to this, right, that we spend a lot of money, that there's a lot of effort in our first three lines of defense, and the way that we posture ourselves for success, the efforts of immense efforts of the people within our organizations, whether it's our HR business partners helping us understand the people risk and driving it, or our chief information security officers helping protect our businesses, right, and enabling that type of growth and competitive advantage, that there really is, to a degree, an illusion of preparedness, right? There's this idea that as you look through this and you think about these ideas of what is it that I'm telling myself is important to my organization, and how is it that I'm allocating resources to deal with it. Derek, I think this gets exactly the point that you are raising about, again, this idea, are we using and deploying the right metrics, right? For instance, if almost 90% of the survey respondents are telling us that emerging technology is important, but only 9% are highly prepared, right? It raises the question about why is this? And Paul, I think your comments in the chat were spot on, right? Harder to measure something that's not as clear. I can't touch it and feel it today, but I need to be thinking about it. But it's also this idea that when we come to sort of the measuring what matters and thinking about it, and this example that the three of us have highlighted this today for our discussion, right? That again, this idea of everybody is focused on regulatory risk, and indeed globally, regulatory risk was the number one concern of the clients in the survey as we're starting to move through thinking about what sort of the new normal means as we're extending into this era of COVID. But the regulatory risk was the dominant concern of the respondents. And yet the ability to measure this, right, evaluating those primary exposures was only at about 28% of the overall respondents. When we measured that at the comprehensively measuring the risk, we were in the low teens. So again, it's this idea of this is the biggest concern. Are we actually measuring what we're telling us, right? I think that adage, the adage that is right, that we manage what we can measure and what we can see. And that really leads us back into this idea of anticipation, right? How is it that we can posture ourselves for the unexpected? How is it that we can truly measure dynamic risk across the enterprise? So this leads us into the next question, right? Is whether or not resiliency can be measured. And I've already on the next slide, and let's go to the next poll question if we can, please. Right, I've already sort of given them the answer that we think that the answer to this is yes, that we can measure resiliency. So I'd be curious from this group, right, you all as leaders, how is it that you view yourself and how resilient are your organizations? Remembering those two different components of the definition of resilience, absorptive capacity and posturing for competitive advantage. And the answer is, I think probably not surprising, right? That the vast majority of us believe that it's moderate resilience, right? Very hard to think about the future and understand those shock events and understanding those, which means, again, how is it that we can anticipate the unexpected and start to define it? So that journey to resilience on the next slide, and the question about understanding and this redefinition that we've been talking about, as maybe we go forward one slide, please, is really about a journey, right? This is not about a destination. When we're talking about becoming and establishing a resilient culture, it's about the roadmap. It's the progress that we're moving forward. And one of the pieces that we've done that we've undertaken with experts like Derek and contributions from other leaders like Paul in this, is to ask ourselves a question of what are those metrics? What are the drivers of resiliency? And can we measure those? And looking over 2 decades of econometric research, right, very rigorous studies that talk to us, that inform the way that we viewed how organizations performed in types of acute crises and those of more extended crisis events like we've been seeing through COVID, but also broader systemic shocks, also like the financial crisis of 08-09, that there were about 32 different qualities that defined in resiliency that we've now mapped into 4 larger conceptual buckets, if you will, that you see listed on the left part of the slide. Number 1, can I anticipate the risk, right? Am I understanding what is next? What is it that could challenge the assumptions of my organization strategy? What is it that can create that operational risk for my organization? That is the number 1 variable that has the greatest explanatory power within the metrics that we've developed and really, again, over 2 decades of research on this topic. But anticipating risk isn't enough if we're not forecasting, if we're not creating and deploying scenario-based financial stress tests, if we're not measuring risk, quantifying it in a way that relates it back to our P&Ls and our balance sheets, it's very difficult to do something with that anticipatory dimensions of risk. And then really drives us into the 3rd dimension, which I don't think will be a surprise to you all in this call, but is how agile our organization, and are we learning from those around us in our sense of this resiliency? And finally, what we were alluding to before is how collaborative our risk functions. What we've seen though in these 4 factors, when we looked at these across almost 2,000 organizations globally, is that organizations that displayed the highest amount of resiliency across these 4 factors had a total share return that was almost 3x that of their closest competitors during quarters in crisis, right? So this isn't just something that we think about in an academic context, right? This is really about shareholder value, return, brand reputation, and the way that we think about it and can be measured. So, but the problem when we talk, and Paul, I think your other comment in the chat was exactly right about emerging tech. Again, this idea of why is it hard to think about forward technologies really means that what we need to do is then bring this back into focus with traditional asset categories on the next slide, right? That because all of these 6 perils that we looked at in this emerging risk Diagnostic, as we go to the next slide, please. These 6 emerging risks are really defining these in terms of the way that we think about our traditional asset categories. The people risks that we're dealing with, right? Our human capital, our clients and customers really as an output from that, our share price if we're publicly traded, but our physical assets, our reputational dimensions, and our supply chain, right? These classic asset categories, the way that we've always measured risk, the question now becomes, I think, Paul, your other comment about seeing emerging tech and this idea that it links, even has links into ESG, is we need to think not just about what does cyber risk mean to my organization, but it's what does cyber risk mean across these 6 different asset categories? How is it that I can view these other dimensions of risk or these perils against these 6 asset categories to gain a fuller picture of my risk organization? So let's turn to the report findings, Derek, and let's take a look at where we go forward from here.
Thanks, Reed, very much for kind of that scene setting of what it means to be resilient in the face of these 6 emerging risks. And so what I'd like to do now is just take a bit of a closer look at some of the insights that we can draw from the responses from the clients that took the survey from across Asia, of which I think we're just over 200 now from across all industries that are represented here. And for the data set that we have so far, what we see is that clients identify pandemic, cyber, and emerging technology, or what I like to call disruptive technology risks, is being the highest concern, which, and very interesting on the other end of that spectrum, geopolitical risks being the least important, in fact. And as I just quickly refer back to my notes from the survey that was taken here, we have actually ESG being the highest. And again, I say I'm encouraged by that because we see a lot of data points starting to be linked that these risks, physical risks from climate change are real and are material and will only increase in frequency and severity going forward. But I'm also wondering, is there a bit of a recency bias that might have been introduced by us focusing on that at the beginning of the conversation? Regardless, we'll speak a little bit more on this subject as we go along. Next slide, please. So we had just spoken about what were the most important risks to clients. And then we also asked in the survey, what are the most impactful risks to the business? And the answers came out a little bit different with a slight area of overlap. So those would be regulatory risks, emerging technology, disruptive technology risks, and then geopolitical risks. So the area of overlap is emerging technology, both very important and highly impactful. So there should definitely be a focus there. And of course, it'll depend organization to organization, but that seems to be an area of focus for the immediate term and then going forward. And it's interesting because what we're looking for in the advisory is a possible disconnect between the most important risks that are identified and the risks that have the greatest impact. Because if you're identifying different sets of importance and impact, our question as advisory consultants are, well, what criteria are you using to inform your vote for what are the most important risks? So we kind of want to bridge that gap and bring those together and look for any opportunities to clarify the importance based on impact to the business. And as we move along here, I'm just kind of referring back to these notes where emerging technology for this group was actually ranked, I believe, number 6 out of 6. So I find it fascinating from a kind of statistical point of view, and I think we said there would be no math, so we won't go too deeply into that. But I think it's going to gives us a reason to go back and consider the data set. But for emerging risks, emerging technology, I would say that regardless of where the technology comes from, whether it be Silicon Valley, Europe, Africa, Middle East, or Asia, we see rapid adoption of new technologies in Asia, regardless of where the source is. So we don't want to lose sight of that disruptive technology impacts here in this part of the world. Next slide, please. So everyone always wants to know how we compare and how we benchmark against competitors in industry, same industry against different regions. And just touching briefly on this is you will see that the 4 levers of resilience, there's not a lot of difference between Asia and kind of the global responses. In fact, only 2% in any given category, any lever of resilience. I think we can draw from the very large data set that we have collected that US firms tend to do on average a little bit better. Asia and continental Europe are pretty much on par with each other. And then kind of Asia and continental Europe are performing better across the 4 levers in general than our Latin American-based companies. Next slide, please. So I quite like this matrix. And what we see at the top, again, are the 4 levers of resilience. And down along the side are the 6 perils. And if you treat this as sort of a heat map, right, kind of your stoplight kind of framework, we want to focus in on the red areas. And the red areas that we see are in terms of anticipation. And if you'll recall, Reed pointed out that the ability to anticipate risks and how they will change and increase in importance is possibly the most critical of the 4 levers. So we see that cyber and emerging tech are showing up red for our clients. And that I think you wonder, how do we build in the ability to anticipate better? Well, I certainly think it's around kind of having the kind of enterprise risk processes, put it on kind of the radar, so to speak, to monitor and assign accountability for monitoring how these risks are changing, increasing in prominence, and could affect the organization. In terms of emerging technology, it's the same thing. In fact, I just had a conversation with a client earlier this week about their specific responses to the risk resilience diagnostic. And they mentioned that they actually have a business intelligence team that is constantly scanning the horizon for disruptive technology, but also being able to take opportunities to leverage technology themselves. Now, for all the kind of representatives on this call, you may not have the resources or the need to have a dedicated business intelligence team, but certainly there should be somebody within the organization who has a responsibility and accountability for monitoring these issues, and then escalating and reporting that to decision makers and those with kind of budgetary and operational authority to kind of respond to those changes. As we move down to geopolitical and pandemic kind of perils, we see that we move to the right where the major gaps are in organizational agility. And again, organizational agility are the resources in terms of teams, plans, processes, budget that you can put to responding to a risk in mitigating the likelihood and impact of a loss or acute incident. And our sense is that because these are what we call systemic risks, these are very big, bigger than any one organization. And oftentimes when we speak of the pandemic, bigger than any one country. There may be a sense that you can't do much as an organization to deal with this. And there's kind of, well, we hope the government will come to our rescue. And what we want to kind of offer is a counterpoint is that in systemic risk type events, everybody is dealing with the same situation. And the likelihood that somebody's going to come into your rescue, including your own government, goes way down because the resources are spread incredibly thin. So that's where we really encourage our clients to dedicate resources and build those internal resilience capabilities in a very intentional way. And when it comes to pandemic in particular and geopolitical, it's crisis management, it's incident response that can give you a lot of leverage in increasing your resilience capabilities. So having those plans, having a crisis management incident response team selected, and then training to become efficient and effective in implementing those plans, processes, and procedures when called upon. And when we come down to the regulatory section, I'm wondering, Reed, I think you had a kind of an interesting example that you were going to share with the group.
Yeah, Derek, as I'm listening to you describe this, I think something really powerful is coming to the forefront, right? That when you talk about these resiliency levers, kind of what you're describing in these solutions, that's really our capabilities we have to develop to be able to deploy this. And in the regulatory instance, working with an Asian conglomerate that is increasing operations in the United States, the challenge for that leadership team was, how is it that we can better understand the regulatory environment and indeed the interaction between the geopolitical environment and the regulatory environment? Paul, I think the phrase that you used at the top of the call was this idea that as the United States and China tussle over this, right? And so how that regulatory environment in the US is evolving, presenting challenges to that organization. And so the question's then asking, we're developing a set of categories about where the regulations were likely to change from one state to another against different issues. So for instance, for workers' compensation versus construction standards versus different codes, and how should that organization be able to both proactively manage that, but anticipate when the scrutiny perhaps was going to be increased on them because of domestic political pressures in the United States. So oftentimes we tend to think about regulatory risk as a domestic political issue where our organizations are domiciled, and yet increasingly, Derek, it's really becoming something intimately and inexorably tied to geopolitical risk in the geographies and the jurisdictions in which we operate.
I appreciate the insight, Reed. Thanks. And before I leave this slide, I'm just going to talk one more point, which is climate ESG, an area which I'm very passionate about. Whereas the broader kind of Asian client base responded that they feel pretty good about their ability to anticipate and model and forecast these risks and respond to them. I'm encouraged by the identification of this group as climate and ESG being a major concern. So there's three main pillars to this that we encourage clients to use to prepare. And that is ESG risk, which is largely measuring, reporting, and disclosing the KPIs around environmental, social, and governance issues. Charting out a sustainable transition for your business model, which to many companies means got a net zero for carbon in the future. It could be 5, 10, 20 years out. And then finally, and most importantly, we see right now is really get a good understanding through modeling and forecasting, what are your people and your assets exposure to climate change driven physical risks in the form of natural catastrophes such as flooding and typhoons of increasing frequency and intensity. All right, next slide, please. So it's a whole lot of information, a lot of data points to take in. So of course we want to help, as we said before, help you focus on what matters, measuring what matters, and then managing what matters most. And when we take the body of data for Asian clients, what we're looking for is kind of the largest divergence between self-assessed preparedness and then self-assessed resiliency. And we have three of the perils kind of pop up, and those would be in emergency technologies. Interestingly, not for this group through a self-assessment, but surely for most organizations that have taken this. Cyber is probably no surprise as we see that cyber attacks and breaches by the various actors being nation states, hacktivists, and cyber criminals are only increasing. And if anything, kind of the economic impacts of COVID are driving more activity into the sector as a way to earn money. And regulatory environment. We've seen very recently how regulators are moving swifter and with less probably dialogue and consensus development than before, particularly around ESG and climate change, as we just do not have years to debate this anymore. So we foresee action being taken much quicker, and therefore that brings in transition risks to organizations. Can you deal with rapid regulatory changes in the near term successfully? Okay, next slide, please. So the takeaway, one more slide, please. So where do we go from here? again, we really want to use the second half of 2021 to reassess the organization's approach to risk management. And that means prioritizing emerging risks based on exposure, understand where you're exposed and to what extent you're exposed to inform the resources you need to put in place to prevent a loss or acute incident and then mitigate it should it occur anyway, like a natural catastrophe. There's very little you can do to prevent that from happening altogether. Then develop those forward-looking strategies. I would liken this to kind of when you make an investment, a financial investment for your retirement, and you read the prospectus, and it always say that past performance is no guarantee of future returns. The same applies to risk management. Just because a risk or a threat has not been evidenced by historical precedent does not mean that it could not happen tomorrow. So please adopt a forward-looking view. Try to look around the corner or over the horizon at the scenarios that could severely impact your people, your assets, and your reputation. And then finally, based on these analyses, refine the processes to increase the knowledge in the organization. Take a continuous improvement approach. That is where, when we talk about resilience, you are not only able to get back to business as usual, but we want to go for getting back to business better than before. And you do that through continuous improvement and learning and lesson sharing. A final slide, please, for me at least. So the good news is, if you have not yet taken the Risk Resilience Diagnostic Survey, there's still an opportunity to do so. And we do encourage you so you can get bespoke reports, individualized data and benchmarking against your industry and all respondents, which are now over 2,000 around the world. And we look forward to being able to present those results to you and potentially have a deeper conversation about increasing your organizational resilience. Final poll question. So, would you, in fact, like a specific assessment of your company based on the completion of a simple questionnaire? And we can tell you that for clients, it typically takes no more than 15 to 20 minutes to take our online survey. See if these results comport with our previous results, which I hope the answer is yes. Okay, so looks like we're, okay, here we go. All right, so good. Already participated in the survey. Wonderful, thank you for joining us for this session as well to increase kind of your understanding of how we look at resilience to emerging risks. And I think that we are ready to take questions now, either through the chat group, or we would love it if you actually are able to come off mute and we can do that verbally. Thanks so much.
Derek, Reid, so thank you. So we sort of slightly run over. We've just sort of got 5 minutes left, but obviously we've shared a lot of content on a very, very, very broad topic here. So I do appreciate that. So a lot to absorb. But just quickly back to some logistics. So there is a 32-page risk resilience report that Derek and Reid have really talked about here. If you don't have that, that is available to you. There is a 2-page executive summary of that report, for maybe easier reading or kind of sharing with your bosses or whatever. And then there is the opportunity to, as 63% of you have now asked, and we will follow up with you to do the short survey and get a 2-page specific report to your business. And then as a follow-up to that, either from the output of those reports or any questions you may have that you don't have time now, or you need to think about a little bit more, then please just contact your client executive directly at Marsh, wherever you are in Asia, and or feel free to contact any of us on the panel here today. We're very happy to engage with any of you in those around those discussions. And also, we will make available to you, the deck and the presentation today. So all this information is available for you to spend a little bit more time absorbing. So I think just in the last 1 or 2 minutes that we've got, so either for Derek or perhaps Reid, because obviously I know you've been doing a lot of work around this over a longer time, but from your engagement with global clients on this topic, what are some of the sort of practical steps that you're seeing companies engage in as a result of these discussions?
Yeah, Paul, I think it maybe it's kind of threefold. Number one is, where the measurement is showing that I think I'm prepared, but I'm not as strongly prepared, is rapidly deploying an assessment on those areas, right? Where there's that gap, Derek, that slide that you showed before. And then secondly, as part of that assessment is developing some financial metrics to go with this, right? Building out those financial forecasts, that financial stress testing methodology. And the reason why I think that's important is what our clients are seeing is when they can put these risks into dollars and cents, right? It creates the imperative to act. It translates it to the board to invest in resiliency. And then you can start to get at this point of understanding how insurance can play such a critical role in this, and develop number 3 measures of return on investment of where across everything that I need to improve from resiliency, are those efforts going to reduce the volatility in my balance sheet the greatest.
Okay, I can see here the interesting question from Keith Zhao as well. I think you can read the question, but if not, it's for emerging risks. We don't really have much history. So how do we know that, how can we model it?
So I would say that if you haven't collected the data yourself, then certainly there are companies like Marsh Advisory that have access to this data and have been collecting it for some time. And of course, we have people who are far better at me than the mass in terms of being able to build models that give a high degree of fidelity in projecting out into the future. So, and this works very well in particular for climate change, physical risks as well. Even though cyber breaches are we considered an emerging risk, they've been going on for quite a while, and there has been a large body of data built up around cyber risks as well, even though it hasn't been around that long already. So just encourage you that if you kind of don't have those internal capabilities, feel free to ask for a little bit of help on those areas.
Yeah, and I think maybe to wrap it up, unless you guys want any last, and then I'll just comment and then ask you guys for a couple of last comments just to wrap it up in the last couple of minutes. But I think to encourage everybody, of course, the risk landscape looks incredibly complex to us and getting more complicated all of the time. But some of the tools that we've kind of learned as risk management practitioners, we can still apply them to this sort of new world. I mean, if you took cyber as an example, obviously a completely whole new risk area, but we still can approach it from the old risk management or the risk management framework of what could happen. If it does happen, what are the financial consequences or other consequences of that? What is the frequency it's likely to happen? Are there some financially sensible controls we can put in place to minimize that? And then at the end, are there some? Are we comfortable retaining that risk? If we're not, is there some viable insurance we could buy? So we can still apply these, the standard risk management frameworks to some of these new risk areas with, as Derek said, using some data which maybe you don't have, but maybe we can access from our global network. So Derek, some last comments from you, and then Reid, maybe last comments from you, and we'll wrap it up.
Sure. Final comment, Paul, thanks. Is that while we've talked about 6 classes of perils that are emerging in prominence, we don't want our clients to ignore the fact that these are often interrelated, right? They don't exist in silos. So if we take a look at the pandemic drove geopolitical and regulatory change, which affected many types of business models, especially when we look at supply chain. So don't just look at the perils in silos. Look at how they're interconnected and may impact your business model.
Yeah, Reid.
Paul, thank you very much for hosting this. I think my final comment to this esteemed group would be simply that we need to challenge the questions that we're asking ourselves about risk. right? That we need to find ways to bring risk management to the table in our organizations because of the vital role that those on this call play in protecting the balance sheets, the share price, the shareholders' interests, and indeed the livelihoods of the employees that are there, in these companies. So I think in driving that alignment between risk and strategy going forward with this volatility from these emerging risks is only going to become more critical as we move forward.
Right, thank you. Great. So thank you very much, everybody, for taking the time to join us today. Obviously, everybody's very busy, so we very much appreciate that. But as I said, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us with any questions you may have as a follow-up. We'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much.